I'll actually, because this way I can actually read it too. Just faces this preface. This is our start-off slide to give us a bit of context. So I'll read through some of the. I'll give some a little background context. It's a Twitter. This is September 2016, and it starts off with Gabe Roy from Microsoft. Actually, he wasn't at Microsoft yet then. He was still at Deus? Yeah, he was still at Deus. And at the very top, it's saying, I had some signals from the @Cloud Foundry ecosystem might move in the Kubernetes direction. Guess not, because he's responding to a TechCrunch article. Then, yeah, so yes, at the time, I was with HPE. There was a project called CF Furnace, which we actually did with IBM. And we had proposed a talk to KubeCon. Hey, let's get Cloud Foundry running on Kubernetes. And that was called CF Furnace for, I guess, the firestorm it started. The highlighted tweet in the middle is Sam Ramji, the CEO of the foundation at the time, saying, that refers to CF Furnace, which is a research project. It was. You know, it's open source. But dead on arrival, as Michael Frankel well knows from TechCrunch. And he then later comments, you know, someone says, but that's not correct based on my info. And it's like, well, you're welcome to check as CEO of Cloud Foundry, I possess the facts. 2016. We'll then continue to now.
Fast forward.
Do you want to keep that there? Or?
That's, you can leave it there. It's there for posterity.
All right. All right. You see our faces here anyway. All right. How many of you have been in this panel discussion in the past? Jules, you were there, liar.
I'm trying to forget.
Okay, it started with Bernd's idea, and it used to be called the Will It Blend panel because the discussion back then was about will Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry blend, and he kind of took after the Will It Blend YouTube series. I don't know how many of you here are familiar with the Will It Blend. Is anyone here that does not know the Will It Blend series? Okay. So for those of you, there were a few hands. For those of you that does not know that, on YouTube, there's, I don't know what that person's name is, but they literally take, let's say, an iPhone and put it in a blender and turn it on because they want to see will it blend, like will it crash into pieces. They just do all sorts of bizarre things, and I'm pretty sure they do good things as well. So the initial discussion kind of started with, will these two technologies blend or should it blend kind of thing, and we kind of made this a tradition to have this panel discussion at every summit. It started in Boston, and I was a newbie at the time with the foundation, so I had no clue what questions I was asking. I just kept asking because I was told to ask some questions. But over the past 2 years, at least, I've gained some experience. So we renamed it back in Philly. Yeah, back in Philly, early this year, we decided to rename the panel because it kind of moved on from just blending these two things to having a little more, and it was kind of an experimental kitchen because Project Irene was there, Project Quarks was there, and there were discussions about the Cloud Native Build Packs project is also going on. So there are one too many projects that are going on in the ecosystem, not just the Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes projects. So that's when kind of folks decided that, okay, let's call it a Cloud Foundry test kitchen, because in this test kitchen, we're experimenting a lot of recipes. I kind of imagine one of you as Dr. Jekyll and Hyde and experimenting with a lot of things. But anyway, so the reason we also have an extended time for this session, and the reason why I'm not sitting there, is because we want all of you to ask questions. So I will start off with a kind of basic question so that it gives you time to think of the questions, what you want to ask. I honestly don't have many questions prepared. I am relying on you to continue the discussion here. So I'll just start off with my basic one. We've seen all the...
Should we all introduce ourselves?
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you.
So that the folks in the room
thank
know
you,
who
Cornelia.
we are.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Please do.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cornelia Davis. I work for Pivotal. I've been with Pivotal since the spinoff. I came there from EMC, where I worked in the corporate CTO office, doing architecture and emerging tech, and to a large extent, that's what I still do at Pivotal. I do that in the context of I'm about 50% field-facing, spend time with customers and partners, and then the rest of the time internal-facing, helping to drive our product strategy. And there's been a lot of emerging tech since Pivotal was spun off 6.5 years ago. Initially, that emerging tech was why we're all here, Cloud Foundry. And more recently, that emerging tech has been Kubernetes and friends. And really my focus is on how do we tie that to business value, because otherwise those are just interesting tech projects, but it's when we get business value that it gets really interesting.
Hi, I'm Jeff Hobbs with SUSE, Director in the Advanced Solutions Group, which includes Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes, both my responsibilities at SUSE. And you've been in the space for a while, working on and innovating around Cloud Foundry since it was open sourced, and just trying to always build sort of innovative solutions around that and innovating more in it as we try and address the developer experience for other enterprises.
Hi, my name is Bernd Krannich, working at SAP as a technical lead in the SAP Cloud Platform. Been with SAP for, I guess, 21 years, which kind of makes me a veteran, I guess. Working in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem since, I guess, the foundation was created 2014, maybe even a bit before the foundation creation. Working with like these people, but then also like many people inside the companies that make up the foundation to, essentially get Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes going. And this is like not so much of an effort that like individuals drive, but this is really a community effort that's going on there.
All right, and my name is Simon Moser. I work for IBM since, I don't know, I think 15 years or something like that. So that kind of makes me a veteran too. In the Cloud Foundry ecosystem since, I think, 2015-ish, 14, 15, something. So maybe just after Bernd and joined there too. In my day job, I'm responsible for running the IBM Cloud Foundry service, which is a public cloud serverless offering where you can just push your applications onto a Cloud Foundry hosted thing, but also doing a lot of community work and hanging out with these people all the time.
Yes, the foundation is going to be 5 years old come January. So last year, introducing myself, thank you. I'm Swarna Podila. I work as a community manager for the Cloud Foundry Foundation. I work for the foundation. I'm not affiliated with any of the members, but I do work with all of you, so I'm assuming you've seen my face. Last year, or early this year in Philly, if someone had told me that there would be the demo that Simon did today on keynote stage, I would have probably assumed they're lying. But here we are. So with all those changes, the whole IBM OpenShift demo and the VMware's move of its intent of acquiring Pivotal, I will start with first Simon. Kind of tell me what you see the state of this whole blending looks like, because it has now gone beyond just Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry.
Well, that's a tough one to start with, so I'll try. I mean, okay, so I think actually we, looking back when we started out with what eventually came up to become Project Irene, right? And actually it goes back to the tweet that we just saw. I think there's a good reason why we're not talking about blending anymore, because the blending has actually happened. I mean, there is commercial offerings out there. IBM has one, SUSE has one, and probably a bunch of other companies too, or at least are on the way to get there, to basically ship an entire Cloud Foundry foundation as a containerized solution, and not foundation, a Cloud Foundry platform as a containerized solution on top of Kubernetes. So I think we are beyond the blending stage, right? We kind of realized as a community, and most people here in the room as well, that having Kubernetes as the backend scheduler for your Cloud Foundry developer experience is a great idea, and that's probably what we should go moving forward. So I think we're well past the blending stage. From that perspective, going back to the little technology experiment that I've been showing this morning on stage, on the keynote stage, this is going to be, just another proof point that the technology that we have been building, and Quarks is in the picture here, Irene is in the picture here, actually works quite well because you have an underlying standard. And from a technical perspective, an OpenShift platform is actually not that different from a native or plain Kubernetes platform. So it was not that much effort to, take that step that I demonstrated this morning. From that perspective, I think, like I said, we're well beyond the blending stage. And I think what we as a community have to ask ourselves is, what are the next steps going to be, right? So, and when I say that, I had this discussion this morning at the NewStack's pancake breakfast, a complicated word, pancake breakfast, where we are looking at, okay, what could be the next step for the Cloud Foundry community, right? Like, where do we have to extend our programming models? Is, for example, serverless functions something that we need to get into the, into our programming model, into our platform? Do we need further alignments with other open source initiatives like, let's say, Istio, or pick a different favorite project? Because I think one of the strengths of our community is actually that Cloud Foundry has been proven to be able to adopt latest and greatest technology multiple times by now, and be able to integrate that technology, still preserving the Cloud Foundry developer experience, ease of use, maintainability, and all of that. And I think if we just continue doing so and be open to other new technology that comes up, that's kind of like, I think, where we're going.
Bernd, this was your idea, right? The panel discussion. So how have you seen the whole thing evolve?
So I would definitely agree to what Simon said, kind of borrowing from the analogy. I would say, like, now the question in the test kitchen is, what are all the recipes that we are about to create? But, like, one thing is definitely, as Simon has shown, taking Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry and spinning up completely new systems for, like, new people. And then I see also that other scenario of many people already have a Cloud Foundry system being deployed, managed with Bosch, and up and running with productive scenarios. So, like, the other recipe that I think we as a community need to develop is to come up with a strategy of how such a system will evolve over time into potentially that very same thing that, like Simon has shown, a thing that runs solely on Kubernetes. And there's, I guess, many detailed questions in that recipe that still need to be answered in order to get there. So I see that as an important discussion that's about to start in terms of where that whole thing will go, and also in which steps and like time frames this evolution will actually happen.
Would you like to add anything to that?
As I put up as the somewhat provocative tweet, it's just a representation. It's almost 3 years ago, practically to the day, and really that was about politics, not the technical, but it represented at the time something that we didn't really quite understand. There was a strong view that Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry were directly in technical opposition to each other, rather than things that could actually work really well together. And a big reason that we've been able to get to this part is not just showing the technical, but as you do the technical part to say, hey, we do operate on top just fine, you're realizing the Cloud Foundry developer experience is the biggest strength that Cloud Foundry is bringing, and having a different infrastructure underneath, especially at the rate of pace that Kubernetes has evolved and matured, they can be very symbiotic. But the other point, as I've learned in 3 years from the start of these projects to now, is, wow, that was Kubernetes 1.1 or 1.2 we were starting on. boy, was that an immature platform. You know, that when we talk about Quarks and Irene, it's important to know we've been talking a lot about them today. Neither of those are actually at the production quality, but we do actually have containerized Cloud Foundry running production ready on using some of the previous versions of those technologies. The reason that Irene and Quarks exist is moving in the maturity of the Kubernetes platform itself. And so it is sort of an interesting mode where everyone assumed, oh, it came from Google, it's going to be great. Well, they kind of forgot a lot of things along the way. Or just, you know, you have to remember when Google was using Borg pre-Kubernetes stuff, they didn't care about naughty neighbors, right? Because they operated in a walled garden. Kubernetes comes out and it is nowhere near the strength of the multi-tenancy that Cloud Foundry has. Now, can we learn more and provide more functionality on even just the Kubernetes experience, adapting those things from Cloud Foundry? And those are the more interesting discussions that we're getting into now.
Yeah, so I'll cue off of something that you just said, Jeff, which was this concept of whether Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry are in technical opposition or in opposition. And that is still, I mean, that question, maybe in this room, on this panel, feels like it's answered, but out in the wild, that's still very much a very lively discussion. And I think that the roots of that question go down to the way that Kubernetes, to some extent, is marketed. It is marketed as a developer platform. People talk about that, it being something that developers want to use. Now, I've reflected on this a bit, especially recently, and the reality is that if you're coming from an infrastructure background, if you, as an app team, as a developer, have the state-of-the-art for you has been EC2 and S3, you've been getting compute, storage, and network, then Kubernetes starts to look like a developer abstraction because it allows me to do things like model my application deployments, and it has that declarative model. And we all know that that declarative model is something that's very valuable in Cloud Foundry. So it starts to, and by the way, I've been with Cloud Foundry for, you know, more than 6 years, and that's what we used to demo 6 years ago. We showed that notion of the declarative deployment and how eventually consistent, you know, constantly healing. And so that is a big part of what people understand Kubernetes to be. But if you come at it from this community and you already have the experience with Cloud Foundry, then Kubernetes starts to look like an infrastructure abstraction. So it really is kind of two different viewpoints. And so it's that, I think that's the root of that conversation. And so I don't think, I completely agree with everything everybody has said. It's clear that there is no Cloud Foundry without Kubernetes, and that Cloud Foundry brings an awful lot more to Kubernetes. But for the non-Cloud Foundry community, it's still kind of a raging debate, if you will.
I will go off of that. Yes. How many of you were at the Unconference? Good. So you all probably have heard Steve Greenberg's talk on the call to developers, right? Call for action to developers. Kind of goes along the same lines. How do we kind of go into the Kubernetes community and help them understand the value that Cloud Foundry brings to Kubernetes community? Does anyone in the audience have either a response or a follow-on question for that?
Yeah, so Cloud Foundry is about the developer experience, but I think an important part is also the operator experience, because there's the deploy thing, right, and that's nice, and then it works, but then you have also the part where something breaks down, and you have to go in and figure out what's going wrong. And in my experience, I'm still missing that a bit. I'm used to Bosch, right? And basically the Bosch deploy story, I think we have that now with, or the CF operator is getting into that kind of territory, right? That's coming out. But Bosch instances, Bosch SSH, and just seeing what's going on, seeing all the processes, being able to, I'm still, I don't know, that feels like we might need something there, right, to have that great operator experience that allows you to run on scale, have something there.
You're familiar with the Bosch experience. I can, throw a dart into a tech crowd and hit someone with the Kubernetes experience. It's 10 times more likely. And that's exactly, though, the for better or worse, they won an infrastructure market share, mind share with Kubernetes. And they've done a good job in that. It's matured well enough. Unlike maybe some other things that get a lot of popularity. You really have to look at them carefully. But Kubernetes is there, and that is true. There is one of the things, in kind of one of the actually well-done things about Cloud Foundry was distinct separation of the operator and the developer experience. It was always a true value add. Now, then the question, though, really is if you can get more value out of a new infrastructure model, let's take advantage of it. And it's true, the Bosch experience 3 years ago was way more stable and mature than anything you could get out of Kubernetes. But that's not true with the latest Kubernetes, all of the extra features. Now you need to add some extra stuff on top of that. We work on it, but it is just a different operational model. And yes, we have to work with people understanding that model.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in very quickly. I think that one of the places that we can put together a recipe is around those personas that you just talked about. I sat down once and actually wrote down some of these things and went through the model of what are the things that the platform team do and what are the things that the app team do. So the people providing Cloud Foundry as a platform or the people consuming it as a platform. And I kind of started to map those over into the Kubernetes space. And the interesting thing is that kubectl, of course, which is the equivalent of CF, right, to some extent, it's actually kind of and here's the point, it's kind of and kubectl is one thing where we have CF CLI and we have the Bosch CLI, right? So with kubectl, you can deploy a workload, you can expose it as a service, so it's maybe a little equivalent to routing, but not quite the same. There's some subtle differences there. But you know what else you can do with kubectl? You can delete a node from your cluster. And yes, true, you can set up role-based access control to keep an individual from deleting a node and allow them to deploy a workload, but you have to set that up yourself. So here is an abstraction that we have nailed in the Cloud Foundry community that I don't see anyone even in the Kubernetes community thinking about those personas. So we think of Cloud Foundry as the open source repositories, but I think of Cloud Foundry as all of the organizational structures that we built around it that we've proven to work. And that's a place where Cloud Foundry has an awful lot to offer to the Kubernetes community.
And just to add to that, so there is, might not be known to everybody who's not following the community too closely, but there is a debate about, or a work group that has just been recently formalized. I forgot this name, I think it's called the Bosch Lifecycle, thank you. The Lifecycle Special Interest Group or something like that, which really, the initial spark that created this work group was to say, okay, if the Cloud Foundry community is embarking on this journey to say everything has to become containerized eventually, and we're all in on that journey, what are the actual gaps that Kubernetes today has that we are known or that we want because we have them in a Bosch, from a Bosch world. So think about, and it ties nicely into some of the stuff that I'm not sure whom of you has listened to some of the Quarks talks that have been happened. But one thing that you probably realized in the Quarks, or in some of the Quarks talk when they talk about the CF operator, is that we needed to invent concepts like ordered sets. Right, where we basically say, if we roll a Cloud Foundry deployment, we just cannot roll every Kubernetes pod at the same time, because it's just going to create a freaking outage, and every operator out there will just love us because it degrades their existing Bosch experience. So we needed to invent additional concepts like ordered sets and extended. I think it's called extended sets or extended sets. So. Ordered extended, so like basically possibilities where you can mimic some of the Bosch behavior. Say, okay, if I have 10 instances of this pod and I'm going to roll them, I'm going to apply a certain order to them in order to manage dependencies and that sort of thing. So I think there is value coming from a Bosch mindset that's even applicable to the Kubernetes community today, and that we could use in order to infuse into this, into the Kubernetes community at large. And everybody in the room, so if you have an opinion about Bosch and an opinion about how that actually should look like, I know not many people do, but those who do, please join this work group and share your thoughts. So if you're one of the lucky persons like me that's actually responsible for running a Cloud Foundry system with Bosch, you might have some scars about that, and
Where do people
might be
find
valuable.
Where do people find the location for this? Is this a Kubernetes working group, a CNCF working group, or a Cloud Foundry working group?
It's a Cloud Foundry working group. So if you are on the Cloud Foundry Slack, which you can also join by just looking up for Cloud Foundry Slack group, look for SIG-lifecycle channel, and you can pretty much get everything there. There's a proposal document and conversations going on. I think there's also a regular call that you all have.
Yes, there's like a weekly call or bi-weekly call, and then a bunch of working documents. I mean, this just got started like fairly recently, right? So it's not been far along yet.
Did you want to say anything, or should I, Bernd? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, question from the audience. I need some of you to raise your hand so I can bring the mic. Any questions?
Okay, so I'll chime on it's production ready to some extent, but not released. I know that some of you guys are working more like in a provider space. I would like refer to, is it enterprise ready? Or is it just production ready, like at provider scale that can just mitigate all the risks that are inside it with just people and stuff?
It's enterprise ready in that it can run in production, it can scale.
I'm sorry, let me ask a clarifying question. What is it?
Your containerized Cloud Foundry. Probably the thing that's missing, and it's missing for Ruben specifically and other people that represent him trying to build that, is not all of the patterns are as well established as they might be in the Bosch camp. Oh yeah, no, we know how to fix that, and you do this, but it's not maybe abstracted behind a command line. And this is actually an area where the separating. So one of the aspects in the Cloud Foundry sort of soup to nuts from Bosch all the way to developer experience is then it allowed you to build very clear paths. Now it's like, okay, whose Kubernetes are you running? How did it get installed? Who's doing, the storage interfaces? It's that extra mix of elements that mean that, okay, you may need to handle your operator stuff slightly differently. And in our experience, it's come from how well do you know how to manage your Kubernetes? The Cloud Foundry stuff is pretty simple on top, but I would argue that most people manage their Kubernetes more poorly than people have managed their Bosch. But again, I would say the inflection point for that is it's going like this for the Kubernetes side.
And I can just second that, like in terms of, like you were asking about production readiness and enterprise readiness for containerized Cloud Foundry. So from speaking as putting my IBM hat on here, I think we have a bunch of customers now who are actually started to be in production on Containerized Cloud Foundry. It's not a big amount of a big number yet, but it's a couple. It's also smaller deployments, but we also have it for the next couple of months a bunch of the really large enterprise heavy regulated. Like think of all the craziness you can think of, who are about to go on production. So I am thinking that the time is right.
Maybe to add to what Simon said, I think another question regarding enterprise readiness might be, is it a drop-in replacement for any Bosch managed Cloud Foundry? And I would say no, there's still some way to go there. Like on the Irene side, there's definitely certain functionalities that the team still needs to complete in order to achieve feature parity between, and Jules is already laughing, so maybe that statement is invalid as we speak, but that's at least, I guess, current state of the art.
I'm just going to try and Steve Jobs mind control you that you don't want any of those features that we don't have.
I see. So, but depending on, like, do you have them already offered to your end users? Reality is at least one of them will be using those features, so it might be hard to move over there. And then in terms of scale, I think like the other interesting question that lies ahead of us is actually one Kubernetes cluster enough to run your Cloud Foundry workloads? And it might be up until a certain level of scale, number of applications, number of requests, etc. But then for bigger deployments, which we at SAP in particular run, the question is, like, do you need to have multiple Kubernetes clusters underneath? And then what does that mean for your control plane? What does that mean for distribution of requests across those Kubernetes clusters, etc., etc.? And I think this is another like interesting discussion area that lies ahead of us.
Do you want to add to that?
I suppose I should have added the caveat, for the production ready, that's still Diego based.
Okay. Who else has the next question? Come on.
Trouble ahead.
Don't be afraid yet, don't worry. No, we're talking a lot about the operator side of Cloud Foundry here. You shortly mentioned, I think it was you, Bernd, about what is next in the kitchen where it comes to the developer experience that the end user actually can expect from Cloud Foundry besides I'm able to push my code. Where do you see that going?
So yeah, I would say definitely the fact that Istio is coming into the stack will like provide the opportunity to then expose more of the Istio functionality to the Cloud Foundry developer, and I think we've seen some examples in the keynotes during the conference there. So that is going to be an interesting thing. Then I guess also the question is like enabling Cloud Foundry on top of Kubernetes. Is there like additional tech, and that might be either infrastructure components that are pulled in Cloud Foundry or just kind of regular Kubernetes tooling that now is unlocked by putting Cloud Foundry on top of the stack. Another area, quite frankly, for me, that is, and I think we had that discussion in earlier panels. For me, that is the second step after kind of enabling the fact that people can actually move over, quote unquote, in masses. So I think that there's definitely opportunities ahead, but for me, like in my mind, I'm still in the process of sorting out that first step, and that means kind of no change, neither positive nor negative, for the people that are using the platform or the developers. If we kind of say operators are obviously also users of the platform, then this is quite a bit of a change, obviously.
I can just add to that. So I think from that, going forward discussion, and there were multiple discussions amongst multiple sets of people throughout the conference now about, okay, what's the strategic outlook of Cloud Foundry? Like, can we work together to get to some kind of a I'm going to call it a milestone plan for the lack of a better word, like saying, okay, the next thing that we're going to ship as part of the Cloud Foundry platform would be an Istio integration. Then the next thing would be, I don't know, what Zach Robinson really nicely demonstrated this morning with rolling updates and V3 APIs and revisions on the Cloud Controller API and those sort of things. I think from all those functionalities and features to me are stuff that's already in the works, and like Bernd said, blending with Kubernetes or basing on top of Kubernetes might even unlock a bunch of things that would make these even nicer. But I don't think that we as a community, right, and the people up here as vendors shouldn't stop thinking about is also what is the next step of where we're going to take this, because those are so to say tiny little increments of functionality and added features as we go forward. But I don't think, like, we as a community, we now have to start bigger. Like, we have to start thinking bigger. That's what I meant. And initially I said I actually envision a world in the more distant future. So it's not something that will happen next spring, but maybe next Christmas, whatever, where we, as a community, are starting to unify the programming models in the sense that, why do I have to run a separate stack if I want to have a serverless functions next to my 12-factor app, next to my container, right? Why is this not going to be some kind of a unified thing behind one platform? And building such a platform might mean that technology has to change and technology has to adopt. And I think this is the discussion, this is the next level of discussion where we have to, so getting Kubernetes in as the orchestrator, step one, doing all these incremental changes is going to be step two, but I think we need to start working on step three right now, which is, lay out the grand vision of where we want to go, pick the right technology for that grand vision, and go and build it.
Yeah, just to add on to that, is because you finally got to the point that if, Stefan, you're asking about, well, where is the next layer for Cloud Foundry innovation? I think the function as a service space, as it were. People are looking at FAS, and there's some major popular frameworks out there, and in the same way they looked at maybe Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry before. And maybe actually you can mix those two better as well. And if I look at the Knative, and I have looked deeply at Knative, it reminds me of Kubernetes 1.0 if I want a FAS framework. But then I think, oh, I actually have Cloud Foundry version, I don't know, 3,500 and whatever it is now.
16.
And it actually gives me 95%. There is 5% that it doesn't. So why do I need an entirely new thing, then rebuild all the stuff? And again, so I want us to make sure as a community we're looking at that and thinking about adopting Cloud Foundry for these other extra 5% that people are finding interesting use cases for.
I would actually be interested in the room. Like, I mean, there must be a couple of people here in the room that are, day to day out there in consulting jobs or working with customers. Do you see similar requirements? Is this something that you comes up in your daily life too, or is this just something that a couple of people in big corporations dream together? Well,
Yeah.
What was the question?
well, the question is, do you see a need for this kind of unification from your daily work?
Unification, be a little more
Well,
specific.
unification in the sense of bringing additional concepts into the platform, like functions as a service, as we did with containers with Kubernetes now.
I asked a question, yes.
Does anyone say no?
I want to say no. So I think this whole foundation is very vendor-driven. So there's a lot of talk about unifying stuff, but Kubernetes came from the outside, and Kubernetes is a very accessible community, and it's very good at picking up like small companies and small ideas. And I think that's why they were moving faster than us, because they have such their footprint, like financially and all of that. If you want to run it on your laptop, that was so much smaller, it was so much easier to try. And I think if function as a service happens, it doesn't have to happen in our area, right? We could just integrate it at some point if we are as open as Kubernetes is at the moment. Then we could just pick it up and make it work for us.
Yeah, I think that you touched upon a theme I think that is very interesting, which is about composability, composition. We've talked about this on this panel before, that Cloud Foundry has always been a complete system, totally opinionated, has everything baked in. And even as an open source community, the way that we've been running, the way the Cloud Foundry Foundation has been running, it's been around this composite, this full solution. And I appreciate your challenge, because you're saying, actually, do we want to, as a community, as a Cloud Foundry community, continue to be about the composition, the highly opinionated composition? Or do we want to, for example, be an environment where we're an integration platform, where it's more around giving tools for the composition or tools for integration, as opposed to being the highly opinionated single platform view? I appreciate that challenge.
Does it have to be an either or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, clearly there's value in having, I work for Pivotal, so we provide a shrink-wrapped solution, and there's huge value in that. And when I look at what people are doing in a Kubernetes environment, many of those same customers are cobbling things together on the Kubernetes side, and it's extraordinarily difficult. So I don't think it's an either or. One of the things I like to think about, though, is a little bit more pluggability. But then it can't be, we're just building everything together, by scratch, from scratch. So it almost becomes a platform for building platforms. Where have I heard that before? So, did you have a comment? I'm sorry, he asked the question and I answered it. Agreed?
He said you got it. Any other questions?
Will there be any functionality that's only available on Cloud Foundry running on Kubernetes?
So actually, that's a very good question, because it exactly reflects a comment from last year's panel, which I asked, when are we going to hit the question, I can only implement this on Kubernetes, can I do that? Yeah, that's probably coming soon. But then we do hit, an inflection point of, that this operates in a different way. But you already have the converse of that, and there are still features such as Windows integration, because Windows integration currently is still all VM based. There's not been work done. So if you're picking the containerized Cloud Foundry, we are exorcising the Windows ecosystem for now. They're working on the container stuff, and that'll come. But doing that right now, there is a choice. You have a few features that can't be brought in. When it happens, what is it going to be, and is it going to be major? There's a lot of choices you can make in a Cloud Foundry ecosystem. If you choose the Istio release for routing, you're getting different routing functionality than if you get the Go router. So those subtle differences already exist, and I don't think they would break us in any way.
But going back, so I actually do envision a couple of things going forward that would probably only be possible to implement on Kubernetes, yes. Well, you could think about, so when we're talking about, catched up on this earlier, we're talking about hard multi-tenancy for Kubernetes. And I mean, kudos to Jules, they did an awesome job securing run C to the best possible, right? But when you look at that, a level deeper, and look at things like, for example, Firecracker, or you look at things like some of this new micro VM stuff that is now getting used in some cases, I could actually see a Kubernetes distribution at one point in time that uses Firecracker instead of Containerd. And once you are at that point, like Bosch and the traditional Cloud Foundry world, like we could make use of that technology for security, for any other non-functional pieces, but that is, I personally don't think it's going to happen in the Bosch world.
For what it's worth, I think that it's like a nice little boundary that I think maybe is worth saying. I think what Cloud Foundry gives you is the standard the developer can expect to exist. It's sort of like the language specification, right? But then you can have multiple implementations of how that maps to the back end. And already we have this Readiness thing, right? So as an operator, you can customize how that CF pushed thing becomes stuff in Kubernetes, right? So as you've got that platform underneath, that Kubernetes platform, you can customize the scheduling, for example. You can put in a custom scheduler to say what nodes it lands on, right? You can use, we had a talk earlier about using persistent volume claims. So you can look at an environment variable that the user put into their CF push and mount a volume in it. And the nice thing about that is none of that changes the CF push experience, right? My app's going to work the same way. As a developer, I don't care. But where it does, I think, give you some features that are new is it gives you a lot more flexibility from that Kubernetes platform as an operator. And the analogy I was saying to someone earlier, GraphQL, if people know GraphQL, if you go to the GraphQL website, it's literally one page. It's a specification. It doesn't contain any implementation, right? It says, here's how you write a client, and here's how you write a server. And in a lot of ways, I see CF actually as that specification of here's what I give a platform as a developer, right? And then as a platform, you can say, how's that going to map to the back end, right, for those roles?
So maybe it's kind of easier to answer your question if you kind of invert it and formulate it slightly differently. I would kind of ask the question of what is the likelihood of the Cloud Foundry community maintaining two parallel code streams forever? I would say that's kind of zero. And then if that is the likelihood, then on which horse would you bet if like one of those streams could benefit from another open source ecosystem that is moving at even a higher pace than Cloud Foundry? And then I think the answer to your question is somewhat clear.
Yeah, I think you just sparked something, a thought. There's a very interesting thing there in that the set of primitives that are available as first-class primitives in Kubernetes is so much richer than what was available on IaaS, and that's exactly what you were just talking about. So another example that I would give is, things around taints and tolerations. Taints and tolerations is not a first-class entity in infrastructure as a service. So it's a primitive that you can use. For those of you who might not know what taints and tolerations are, there are two primitives that you can use to start to control where workloads are landing. So that say, you can't put things here, you can put things there. When we start to embrace those, when you say the operator can start to embrace those, my only concern right now is the split brain. Because right now, things like CAPI, the cloud controller, are assuming a certain level of control of things. And if we now start to use a different control plane to start to control some of those things, we could end up in situations where we thrash and those types of things. So, and I don't think that stops us from moving forward in this direction, but it does start to say, okay, well, how much do we leave in CAPI? How much do we start to rebuild some of the CAPI logic to take advantage of those primitives instead of just using those primitives as an operator from the side? I think we have to think about those things. Okay, that's a problem I want to work on. That's pretty fun.
Any other questions? Anyone else?
So I'm interested to redirect the call of action from the unconference to you. So what would you think, or do you want from us as community, where to engage, how to engage? Do you have any ideas, or what do you think, also in relation, of course, to Cube, what to do, write blog posts, or get crazy, or what do you think?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's because it requires a community's effort. But just, show of hands, how many people have given a Cloud Foundry talk not at the Cloud Foundry meetup or summit? I've had the opportunity at both the KubeCon and Open Infrastructure Summits, and you have to tailor your talk differently. You have to tailor the title differently in the abstract to get it accepted. And I've been rejected more times than I've had accepted. Let's just say that.
Are you signing up to mentor people on how to write CFPs?
I can offer to you review from having some accept. It's you have to know to the community in which you're addressing and what you're trying to. So the KubeCon one was about expressing more about the developer model. I did not actually use the word Cloud Foundry in my abstract. Mysteriously, it appeared on my title of my talk when I was there, but it wasn't in the abstract. So. But that's the thing, is it's great to see a few other hands, but it would be great to see even more. And because remember, it is not an either or. There is a tremendous amount of value in Cloud Foundry from the model that it works on, the composability, several of the things Cornelia mentioned, that we can share with other communities, and we really do need to.
And to maybe add to what Jeff said, so Simon and I were actually trying to get a talk in at the upcoming KubeCon US, which was rejected ultimately, but I think we followed the same strategy, basically not mentioning Cloud Foundry, or at least putting that to the very last sentence in the abstract. And I think as a community, we need to think through why that actually is. Like, I've been in many conversations with people that are coming with a Kubernetes background, and like, as soon as you start mentioning Cloud Foundry or even Bosch, you like come in some strange situations, and people like shut down their blinds, and like then the conversation goes in completely strange directions, because and then you hear those words around legacy, etc., etc. At least I've been in those conversations, and I'm not sure entirely why that is. I believe there's some not invented here. Definitely that's being part of that. But like, why could I, as a single person, come up with a project that does not have the name Cloud Foundry, but then potentially the very same code base, say I'm a startup, and kind of go into the Kubernetes ecosystem and start marketing that stuff? Why is that, and why are terms like Cloud Foundry and Bosch such red signals for the Kubernetes community? Is at least not entirely clear to me.
Well, and I think that we can try to answer that question, or we can just, suffering is the resistance to what is. I'll tell you, one of the things that I do is I don't talk about Bosch all that much. I don't use the name Bosch. I talk about the value that Bosch brings. I talk about cluster lifecycle management. I talk about the deeply embedded versioning. I talk about the packaging. And when I start talking about those capabilities and the business value that brings, then I find that the resistance, the stress starts to go away. And so, I mean, Jeff, you said it yourself, is that you avoid some of those terms even when you're writing the abstract. And it really comes back to the capabilities. And I find that Kubernetes, by and large, is still a pretty techie community. And we, in the Cloud Foundry community, have been very, very good at tying our tech to business value from the very beginning. It was really driven by the business values. And that's something that I don't find exists as strongly in the Kubernetes community. It comes, I mean, they themselves say, we come from a Linux mindset, a bunch of components mindset. And so I think, to some extent, let's not fight that. Okay, I don't use the term Bosch anymore. I talk about the capabilities.
I completely agree with that. In many of the conversations that we've had, without mentioning the terms, if you explain the value of the individual components, light bulbs go on. As soon as you mention it, it kind of offers that kind of resistance. So I think that is a really good point, and kind of tying back the call to action for all of you, I think it's really important. I think even in the last discussion, Cornelia had mentioned that it is more important for us in the Cloud Foundry community to go out into other open source events or other technology events to go kind of explain the value or educate them about the value of Cloud Foundry. And I think this is, it has been the right time for the past 6 months at least, for sure. 2 years ago, maybe it would have been a little too early, a little too soon, but I think it's definitely on to all of you here to take that message out to the rest of the communities.
Yep, and I would just add to that, that I personally don't try to sell Cloud Foundry. Again, I want to emphasize that, is that I don't go out and try to sell Cloud Foundry. I go out and I sell the results that people have realized based on certain capabilities. Because I think that's really the key thing. And there's going to be even better ways for us to realize some of those values on a Kubernetes-based platform that might not even involve some of the Cloud Foundry code base. So I personally don't think of Cloud Foundry as only the code base. I think of Cloud Foundry as a set of capabilities. And if we start thinking of it that way and articulating it that way, I think we stand a far better chance of influencing that community. And if we influence the Kubernetes community with some of the good mojo that we've built over the last 6 years, 7 years, that will be a huge win.
Yeah. And if any of you have an idea and are not sure how to proceed, talk to each other or talk to any of them. Or if you think the foundation can help, we're all here, right? That's how our community has grown. So talk to each other, let's figure out.
Yeah, just one of Cornelia's comments made me think that one of the detracting reasons, these weird detracting reasons people have against Cloud Foundry is, oh, that's enterprise software. One of the great things the Cloud Foundry Foundation has done is build up an ecosystem that really includes the users, not just the builders. And that includes many enterprises. And why does it include many enterprises? Because they've all discovered it works. This software is transformative.
Shocking.
Yeah, shocking. And that gets then to the elements of, well, what is it about that value that we're trying to bring? And you can do it, you can say the big guys are using it, but you know what? You can get that same value into any size organization. And so what's sometimes given as a a slur, oh, that's enterprisey. I mean, I guess Linux is enterprisey now, but still seems to be used an awful lot. So yeah, it is really about what the values that it's bringing, and see that growth and the attraction it has in a relatively quiet and sort of different model. It is a different set of people that you're trying to interact with, but there's a lot of value it brings.
Any other questions, or do you want me to ask one question?
So I actually just want to share, since there's a pause, I'm going to share an anecdote. So earlier this year, I spent a bit of time with a couple of my Pivotal colleagues and a couple of my VMware colleagues doing a kind of a teaching each other about Cluster API, which for those of you who don't know, Cluster API is thought of as a BOSH-like thing in the Kubernetes community. It is something that's used to take care of Kubernetes clusters and BOSH. And the interesting thing, and I'll leave with this, it's just such a perfect example of what we're talking about in the differences in these communities. On day one of my VMware colleagues that came from the Heptio side, Tim St. Clair, who actually leads the cluster lifecycle SIG in the Kubernetes community. When he started, one of the first things that he said, and he was teaching us about Cluster API, was one of the first things he said was, we come from a Linux mindset, we come from an open source mindset, we are all about components, we are all about optionality, etc. When it came time the next day for us to introduce BOSH, we talked about what we had Pivotal called the 5 S's. And we started with what are the values that you get from Bosch? Stability, scalability, cost savings, the S comes on the second word, and so on. And that, I think it's a great exemplar of how these two communities are different. And I don't think that's not a value judgment in either direction. It's just an observation. And as we try to blend or bring together these recipes in the test kitchen, we need to honor actually both of those cultures. So
Understand your audience, right?
Yep.
Tailor your message to the audience that you're trying to build.
And I think that brings us back to what you said earlier, which I thought was excellent, is I think it's going to be very critical for us going forward to find that balance between having a very clear opinion of a bunch of pieces that actually fit together and work together versus, the Kubernetes community, a bunch of Lego blocks that gets dumped out in front of you is here, pick out the ones that might work together. So I think striking that balance between stuff that is curated, opinionated, and working and proven to work versus, if you look at the Cloud Native Foundation, Compute Foundation, it does seem like this. You've seen the scatter diagram of all these technologies out there. It's like, which one do you pick? And then I think that's the big strength of the Cloud Foundry Foundation that we have. And we've got to be very careful, I think, not to lose that.
I might just add one final thing to that. Bernd and myself, we had a very interesting discussion earlier today, and there was an analogy coming up, and this is why I was asking to that very same question of yours earlier, does it be an either or? When you think about, there is Volkswagen. Is anyone from Volkswagen here in the room? There are a couple of people Matthias maybe. You don't count in this my example though. There is, like, when you look at Volkswagen builds cars, as everybody understands, right? And at least people in Europe understand that there is one platform. So you can buy the same car, technically the same cars with a lot of common ingredients, right? And they're marketed under brands of VW, brands of Skoda, brands of, I don't know, Seat, whatever, right? So, but under the covers, it's a lot of the same technology, right? And from that perspective, and then they still differentiate on the brand. Like, Skoda might have the better navigation system in there, or someone might have whatever their distinguishing factor is. But the base components is still opinionated in the sense that someone in the VW ecosystem has decided we're going to use this transmission and everybody's going to use this transmission. So you do not differentiate on transmissions. You can differentiate on other stuff and go off and build your own, right? And I think from that perspective, if we're starting to look at that, the Cloud Foundry Foundation needs to become that thing. That platform that basically says, we have an opinionation, this is the set of technologies that you are supposed to use to build that platform, but allow differentiation at that, at the next level. So if a vendor like Pivotal or a vendor like SUSE or a vendor like IBM then puts together a distribution, we could still put some icing on that cake and make it different and make it unique.
Okay, I'm getting 2 points of feedback here. One says our time is up, and the other says I have 5 minutes. I'm not sure which one is it, but I don't remember, so I will go with, okay, 5 minutes left, thank you. In these last 5 minutes, I want the four of you to kind of summarize either a piece of advice or a suggestion or your thoughts on where should we go from here. I would like to start with Bernd. I always like to call on him because he started this idea. It was your fault.
Okay, sure.
It's your fault.
Of course. So where do we go from here? As I said earlier, I think the interesting conversation will be how do we take today's Cloud Foundry towards the world of, on the one hand, you have that like potentially smaller Cloud Foundry deployment that exists today, and some of the vendors have already commercial offerings out that provide that stuff. But then at the same time evolve the existing potentially bigger Bosch managed systems, and that's for me like a very interesting conversation to have. And I don't think that it's an either or. Like companies like IBM offer both, and I think that's like the interesting twist and turn how to make sure that like people that either decide for one side or the other, or even like going down both routes, are well served and continue to be well served by this community.
Cornelia?
Yeah, so I think there's probably nothing that's more important than that right now. So I do work for a company that has a distribution of both Cloud Foundry and of Kubernetes. And I can tell you that from a very practical standpoint, when you have this area of confusion that we are in right now, it can stall everything. It can stall people's progress. From a sales perspective, it stalls sales, but I don't get paid on sales at all. So I am always, the thing that stalls is the value that organizations could get from that. And so I would 100% agree that there is nothing more important right now than for us to start to think very concretely about what would that evolution look like for somebody who wants to continue realizing the values that they're getting out of an opinionated platform like Cloud Foundry as we make this transition over. Let's keep that in mind, not just the technical components. Jeff?
Yeah, I just, keep an open mind. There's a lot of technologies out there, and look at them for what they offer as benefits, not as individual features. And then I hope to see many of you at some other conference talking about Cloud Foundry.
Perfectly summarizes what I said. Like, I don't have anything to add. Everything has been said.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you.